so now it's 11:30. Okay, so hello. So everybody can hear me, I hope, all the way in the back. Is that a yes? Okay, good. All right, woo! Okay. All right, so my name is Kito. This session is called Modern Web Apps with HTML5 Web Components, Polymer, and Java EE MVC. I added JavaServer to the end here because JavaServer is included as well. And if you're wondering why I'm not there, I threw out my back over the weekend, and a cross-Atlantic trip seemed like a bad idea. So we decided to do this. I can stand just fine. Sitting on a plane for 8+ hours, probably not. So we decided to try this out. So thank you for coming. How's everybody liking the show? Good so far? All right, good. Excellent. All right, so just a few words about myself. My name is Kito. You can follow me on Twitter at Kito99. That's also my username on GitHub. So if you want the source for this presentation and the examples, you can go to GitHub, Kito99. I'm the principal consultant at a company called Virtua, which does training, consulting, mentoring, etc. for Prime Faces, JSF, Java EE, and also on the more front-end side, Web Components, Polymer, etc. And we're also the official US Prime Faces partner, so we're very involved in that community as well. Later this afternoon, I have an advanced Prime Faces talk. I'm the author of an old book called JavaServer Faces in Action. Has anyone heard of this book? I always ask this question because I'm always curious. All right. Sometimes I get like one person. Oh, hey, there you go. Because the book is very old. It's like it came out in 2004, so, you know, it's a very old book. I also run a website called JSF Central. It's not very attractive, but it's a good place to look for JSF info. I also started a new site that doesn't have much on it yet, but it's called noesis.io, KNOWEIESIS.io, that has some stuff on web components. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Enterprise Java Newscast, and that's where me and a couple other guys talk about all sorts of random things related to enterprise Java and tech and programming in general. We also have lots of we also have a guest every once in a while. So if you like podcasts, check that out. You can find it on iTunes or anywhere else, hopefully. There are podcasts. That's my new site. And I speak at lots of conferences like this one. I was actually at the first jDays like 4 years ago, but I have not been here since. And I'm also a member of the Java community process, so I'm involved with some of the Java specs. And the one we're talking about today is MVC. So, how many people out there have used Spring MVC before? All right, yeah, a lot of people. How many people used struts back in the day? All right, so a couple, one of you. All right, cool. All right, so if you look at the Java EE stack, it has a lot of stuff in there. There's tons of stuff. There's JSF, there's JSP, there's JPA, there's JAX-RS, there's EJB, there's CDI, and many more specs, right? But there's no sort of basic action-oriented web framework. JSF does a lot of things in a certain way, which some people like me like, but not everybody wants to use JSF, and sometimes you want to use a framework that integrates better with all sorts of different front-end technologies. So MVC is a new JSR that's part of Java EE8, and I like to always point out that the name MVC is kind of not the best name because the MVC means Model View Controller, and the implication would be that, well, JSF is not an MVC framework, and yes, it is. So, you can take that with a grain of salt, but essentially what we're talking about here is an action-oriented web application framework like Spring MVC. And the main reason we're adding this to Java EE is because of community feedback. There was a survey a few years ago about what would you like to see in Java EE, and there were a lot of people that said they wanted an alternative web framework that they could use instead of JSF. So that's why we are adding MVC to the Java EE stack. The current release is EDR2, and EDR means early draft release. And Java EE is now scheduled, Java EE 8 is now scheduled for the first half of 2017. So think of this as very forward-looking in terms of MVC. I mean, there certainly is an implementation you can work with today, but I would not use it in production quite yet. All right, so MVC is not going to replace JSF. If you have JSF applications, you don't have to worry that they're never going to be supported or it's going to be removed from the platform. It's still going to be there. But the idea is that some people want to use a more action-oriented framework, and this allows Java EE to provide that solution. So this is a look of sort of what a component-based framework like JSF looks like. And the idea there is that the framework does a lot of the controller work. So the framework deals with sort of getting data from the browser, associating it with a view, and your view binds to CDI beans or Spring beans on sort of the middle layer, your model objects. That's sort of the way JSF works. And of course, on your page, you have components that do that binding on the individual views. In an MVC app, you do more of the view stuff yourself. The application doesn't really care that much about it. All it cares about is routing to a controller, and the controller can then decide, what view to go to. And from that view, you can then reference any form beans that you need to reference. And those form beans can be associated with model objects. So the idea with an MVC-based application in this perspective is that the framework is really more lightweight, and more of the work belongs to you as a developer to decide what you want to do. And one of the key things about MVC is that it's really a lightweight framework or lightweight, set of extensions built on top of JAX-RS. So if you're using JAX-RS today to work, with any sort of different front ends, whether it's a pure web front end or a front end running on a phone, on a native platform, you could still use JAX-RS, and then if you wanted to, you could just add a little bit of MVC on top of it where necessary. And I think that's really the benefit here, is that you can still work with JAX-RS, but if you want to use some more traditional action-based or action-oriented routing technology, you can on top of it without having to bring in Spring MVC just to do a few additional things. One of the key differences here is that the controllers must use CDI. So it's really, targeted towards applications which are currently using, CDI, or at the very least, if you want to use the MVC features, you have to use CDI for those features. And if you're not familiar, CDI is context and dependency injection in Java, and it is the dependency injection framework that's built into Java EE. So it's similar to Spring, but it's built into Java EE. Another sort of requirement is that the controllers are in the request scope. And another difference is that you can handle errors inside of a controller instead of globally like JAX-RS. JAX-RS will give you a global error handler, which is nice. But when it comes to dealing with form fields, you may want to just create error messages which you can display back to the user, and MVC allows you to do that. Another nice thing is that with MVC, you actually can bring your own template engine. So you're not bound to use JSP. You don't have to use anything else. But what's great is that there's actually lots of template engines. Well, let me take a step back. The template engine framework is pluggable. You get support for 2 out of the box. And of course, it supports JSP, but it also supports facelets from the JSF world. And those of us who use facelets tend to like that better than JSP. So you have 2 choices. And since the framework is pluggable for template engines, you can also add other ones. And they've already added a whole bunch. There's like Timeleaf, there's, I think, Velocity, and a whole bunch of other ones. So you can use basically any template engine you want to. There's also built-in support for cross-site request forgery protection. There's support for encoding to avoid cross-site script attacks. And that's about it. So I'll show you some code before the end, very quickly, given our time constraints. And that's pretty much the deal with the MVC. It's a pretty lightweight framework, which is nice. All right, so the other side of the coin for this presentation is another new technology, okay? And I want to talk a minute about UI components in general. So, as you guys can tell, I come from a JSF background, and in JSF, we think in terms of UI components, right? And if you think about UI components, you look at any web page on any modern application, you could break it down into different components. So, in this particular picture, there's a data grid or a data table, right? There is up here I would call this like a toolbar. There's a search button. This would be a drop-down menu. This might be a breadcrumb component. These might be sort of like image buttons. And then when you hover over any of these rows, you get some other options. And this is, when you click on this, another menu drops down, right? So if you think about this, these are all different web components, right? And if you think about it, component models have been around with us for a long time in the world of software development. How many people remember Visual Basic? Anybody? Visual Basic? Okay, got a few out there. How many people remember Delphi? Yeah, these products still exist, by the way. So Visual Basic was probably the first development tool to really popularize UI components. And Delphi was the one that I liked a lot. Then they have Power Builders, then a lot of stuff in the .NET world, WinForms, ASP.NET. In Java, we have Swing, because Swing has UI components, JavaFX, JSF, Tapestry, etc. So all these different tools and frameworks use UI components. In the browser, it's the same deal, right? So anytime you use any particular UI suite, whether it's YUI, which is not too popular anymore, Kito UI, Bootstrap, jQuery UI, Infragistics, Prime UI, etc., all these use UI components. And if you look at the way that all the modern JavaScript frameworks are going, they all use UI components too. The most popular examples would be React and also Angular 2. So they really take a component-oriented view of the world. And we build web components, we build UI components because we like abstraction, right? And we like to have reusable code. We're programmers, we're all kind of lazy, right? You don't want to redo the same thing over and over again. So if we can build something once and reuse it the same way you do with general object-oriented principles, it's nice to do that with UI components too. Because at the end of the day, you can focus on your business logic and not like, whether or not you can scroll properly in a grid or something like that. So if you go back to that previous screenshot of the page Dropbox, the deal is that although we may conceptualize all of these different elements as UI components, the browser does not. The browser thinks of them all as a whole bunch of divs and spans and CSS and JavaScript. So, we build all of these layers to sort of give us a component model, but at the end of the day, the browser just deals with divs, spans, CSS, JavaScript, etc. So, for example, this is a prime faces data table. So this is, if you were using prime faces in JSF, you would make a data table like this. You use some XML. You say, this is my data table. These are the objects I'm talking to. These are the columns, right? So all of this gets turned into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but the browser doesn't understand that. The JSF framework understands this. This sort of a high-level view of the world, right? If you were working with Bootstrap, it's a little bit different, but the idea is sort of the same. So you tell the browser, hey, here are some divs and some items that you can display. And then you basically give it some special styles, and then the JavaScript in Bootstrap will turn that into a component with real functionality. Okay, so essentially you have a sort of an API, basically saying, all right, well, if I give these elements certain CSS classes and roles, then Bootstrap will know what to do with it. Okay, so you've basically created a specific way of defining a component for Bootstrap. Okay. And this is an example with jQuery UI. It's kind of the same thing. You give it certain divs, and then you use a little bit of JavaScript to basically turn it into a whole bunch of tabs. Okay, but again, in all these situations, the browser doesn't know what's going on. The browser just is dealing with divs and spans and HTML and CSS. So a web component is actually now a term. It's not just a concept, right? And there is something called web components, and what it does is it brings a native component model to HTML. So whereas before we have all of these different sort of frameworks that provide their own different component models, web components provide a component model that's actually built into the web. Okay, so the browser actually understands it. So if you take an example like this, this is a pop-up dialog, right? So this is a pretty straightforward thing, right? It's a pretty common thing that you might have in your application, but you don't really want to rewrite the same code every over and over again, right? Basically, it's a div with some behavior for a button, right? So in order to do this with a web component, it might look like this. So I say paper action dialog. I give it some properties. Whether or not you want to auto-close it when they click on the button, whether it's layered. And then inside of it, I put a paper button, which is another special button, and I give it some special attributes so that when they click on it, they know this paper action dialog component knows that it's the affirmative, which means yes. And then because I've set auto-close disabled to true, auto-close disabled to false, I guess, it will close, or should close. And, this looks very similar to some of the other examples I gave you, but the difference is that this is actually a web component, and the browser understands it. So this is the markup that's actually in the page, as opposed to being, the markup used by Framework X to turn it into divs and spans, okay? So web components basically allow you to build your own custom elements that have behavior that you can use inside of a web page, and the browser can understand, and it doesn't require that you use Framework X's component framework. So web components is a collection of HTML5 standards. Number one is one called custom elements. And that is sort of the key. That's what allows you to define your own element that you can use inside of a page and give it some actual functionality. There's another standard called HTML templates, which allows you to have chunks of markup that you can then, that the browser doesn't render, but you can then render later. You can add it to the DOM whenever you want to. So it's sort of like some of the front-end templating frameworks, but it doesn't do a lot of fancy things, but it does allow you to have some markup that you can define that you could use, for example, in a web component, and then basically add it to the DOM dynamically later. It also defines HTML imports, which basically allow you to import a whole bunch of HTML, Java, and CSS from one file. And it also supports something called Shadow DOM, which I think is a very cool name. Shadow DOM basically provides encapsulation for CSS and things. So how many people have built a web application using Bootstrap or something else, and you have all of these issues with CSS leaking over into your application between the Bootstrap styles and your application styles and stuff like that? Anybody? All right. So, okay, at least one person. Okay. So Shadow DOM helps with that. So if you use a web component that uses Shadow DOM, the CSS on your page won't leak into it. Basically, the component can say, okay, well, I want to expose these particular attributes so you can help style me, and then you can use those as opposed to having, all of your CSS automatically affect the component. All right, so let's see, we've got about 25 minutes, right? All right, so I am, let's see, does this demo even work? Yeah, I don't. All right, I will show you a different demo for this. This is not the best example in our time frame. All right, so actually, I think probably the best example that I'll show you is this. So there is a website out there that uses web components. That's a very good example. So there's a site called gaming.youtube.com. And I'm not a gamer, so I don't really know what this site does, but it looks cool to me. And since I have kids, you see, it remembers that I've been watching Cars movies and stuff from YouTube. So all that's showing up down here. But you see, it's a nice site. It has a very modern look and feel. I believe it's responsive. Yes, it is. Okay, so you see, it's actually adjusting for me automatically. Okay, and obviously it's supporting a very high volume because it's YouTube, it's Google. But if I look at this site, okay, can you guys see that? Okay, that text. Yes, no. Okay, thank you. All right, so if you see this, if you look at the elements here. YTG-app, okay, YTG-search controller. So these are actual web components that they've built for this application. Iron signals, that's another web component, okay, YTG auth helper. And essentially, these are web components that the browser actually understands, okay, and have functionality built behind them. This is the player, right? And you see there's some styles here specified. Here for this error message, see there's some additional attributes listed for navigation hidden. So this entire application is built using different web components that have different features. Here's a video carousel, which is, you can see where it's highlighted in the middle there. Okay, so that's the home page component. And what's nice about this is that these tags, again, they're not just tags for framework X. They're actually web components that the browser understands. Okay, so to give you some idea of what you can do. So it turns out with web components there is a basic API that's provided by the specifications. Okay, and then there are toolkits that make it easier to build components. Okay, on top of the standard APIs. So there are two main toolkits. One is called Polymer, and one is called Xtag. Okay, Xtag originally came from Mozilla, and now it's sponsored by Microsoft. So it looks like this. It provides support for building web components using using some syntactic sugar on top of the standard APIs. Okay. And the other one is Polymer, okay? And Polymer is sponsored by Google, and Google actually is the biggest proponent of web components, and they've been pushing them for a few years. Polymer, there's a couple different things. Number one, it is a library for building web components to make your life easier in terms of building new web components, but it's also a set of custom components that you can use in your applications. Okay, so if I were to go here, I could find what they call the element catalog. And here they have different components you can use in your applications. They have these iron components, which are sort of core useful elements. There's one for doing Ajax, there's stuff for forms, there's stuff for testing, etc. There's paper elements. These ones are UI elements, which you can use for building applications using the material design look and feel. There are Google Web Components for doing things like talking to the Google API, so you can use one for analytics, calendar, Google Feeds, Sheets. Of course, there's a YouTube component, and of course, everybody likes the map component, right? So you can specify a Google map just like this without having to, use the JavaScript API. Just by using it declaratively, and these are actual components you can put in your page, and then you can get a cute little map like this, right? Okay. So that's an example of that. Let me go back to here we go. And there are some other ones for doing e-commerce and animations and things like that as well. Okay, for core application development, the paper elements are handy because they have a whole bunch of UI look and feel. So you have buttons, list boxes, menus, etc. Okay, and this is what we'll be using for our demo, are the paper elements. Okay, and I'll just pick out one of these. Let's look at this dialog. We were just looking at the dialog earlier, right? So this is a dialog. You can put stuff inside of it. You can add this paper dialog scrollable element for a scrollable pattern, or panel, excuse me, and buttons, etc. Okay, there are certain properties that it has. So all these components, they're elements, just like any other DOM element. So you can actually execute specific properties on them as well, and call methods, etc. All right, so that's Polymer. There's also component suites out there. There's a few. Prime Faces actually has Prime UI has web component support. Kito UI has it. Polymer, which I just showed you, but Sonic is another one. Strand Web Components is another one. These are all open source component suites. And there's also some directories. So if you want to go see what web components are out there, probably the best choice is customelements.io. And I can say, oh, well, I would like a date picker component. Let's see. And lo and behold, there's date picker components. And for each one of these, I can go in there and learn more about it. Okay. So this is a good place to go, customelements.io, just to see if there's any web components out there to do what you want to do. Okay. All right, so the one thing I should mention is that all of this stuff, okay, so I'll just go back a second. All this stuff is essentially not supported in all the browsers right now, okay? So Google Chrome supports everything, and Firefox supports a lot of stuff. Opera supports everything. These features are not in IE. A lot of them are being implemented in Chrome. I'm sorry, in Microsoft Edge. Okay. So if you want to support this stuff, you have to use what they call a polyfill, which is basically a JavaScript library that implements some of these features. Okay. So that polyfill is called webcomponents.js. If you use Polymer, that's included. If you use Xtag, it includes its own polyfill on top of webcomponents.js. And Polymer includes the web components primitives and then its own special features and then custom elements, which are those components I just showed you. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention one more thing about Polymer, then go to the code. So Polymer has lots of special features for making it easier to build applications with web components, including data binding, which is not part of the specification, and things like that. But the key thing is has pretty heavy backing by Google. So it's been used internally by Google. They say it's been used for over 300 Google projects. I'm guessing a lot of those might be internal projects. At least we know that gaming.youtube.com is live using it. They say it's used for over 150,000 public-facing pages. I don't know if that means actual sites or just individual pages. But they're also starting to use it internally for parts of code, which is kind of cool. And it's also very heavily promoted by the Google marketing machine. They have a conference, they have a whole bunch of videos on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so I'm going to go to the demo now. All right, oops, that's for later. Okay, so I've got a very simple application here. Let me go back to it. All right, so this is a sort of your quintessential to-do application. It's a little bit different, but that's the idea. So I can type in my name. If I enter in a wrong password, it doesn't pass validation. And then here's my little login. I get a little happy page. I can go create some tasks. Save it. And then I can check off tasks as being complete. Okay. And what's also cool is, let's say, I had another user. All right, I logged in with I have the same login, but this will still work. All right, save that. And of course here, if I just refresh it, of course I can see it here. So it's just a very simple little app. Also has an about page. Okay. So in order to do this, if you look at the actual layout of the application, it's pretty straightforward. This was actually built using something called the Polymer Starter Kit, which has a whole bunch of sort of basic scaffolding for building web applications with Polymer. So the whole basic look and feel that you have here with this drawer look and also just built-in responsiveness, if I can get that to work. Okay. So that sort of built-in responsiveness stuff is part of Polymer. So you see that drawer shows up here, etc. All right, so let's go back to the login page. This is the first page here. Okay. And a lot of this stuff came from the Polymer Starter Kit. There's some scaffolding stuff here. There's some stuff for dealing with different mobile devices. But you see, since this is JSP, I'm also using sort of your normal JSP internationalization stuff. Okay, so I'm using a resource bundle here. The name of the application comes from the resource bundle. Okay, so it is a login title. And Polymer, if you want to use the Polymer features inside of a main page, you use this template element here. So inside of this, everything in here can use Polymer data binding features. But this here is a server-side data binding. Okay, and this again is normal JSTL to display error messages if there are any. And here is a form that points to this special variable here called MVC, which is the MVC implicit variable, which you can use in the expression language. And from there, you can get the context path and the application path. And then this is the name of the actual action that we're calling. And then inside of here, there are the paper input components that do the name and password, and there's a paper button for submitting the form. Okay. And here, these are required because the paper form, the iron form, which is what's used here. I'm sorry. The paper input controls don't work that well with standard forms. They like to use their own special form. So these input fields are here because of that. Supposedly they're going to fix that in that future release. So there's a little bit of extra JavaScript to populate those fields when you submit the form. And there's this thing here, this hidden, that's saying name MVC, which is the MVC implicit variable again, .csrf.name, value is token, okay? So this is a CSRF protection, okay, that we want to keep our application from being attacked by cross-site request forgery, okay? So let me go back to the login page, okay? All right, so this is the page we're just looking at, right? And I'm going to test, and then I get validation errors, okay? So when you click on this submit button here, let's say actually test 1, 2, 3. Okay, you log in, right? So you're going to call a particular action, okay? And this action is inside of this authentication controller class, okay? So this is an MVC controller, and it's redirect scoped. This one really doesn't have to be, but redirect scope is a new scope in MVC that lets an object live in between requests. So, you know, basically, upon a redirect, if you access the object again, it'll still be available. So that's what redirect scope does. We're using the CDI, so we're injecting a user service, an HTTP request response. We're also injecting this new thing, which is part of MVC called models, okay? And from there, we can put attributes in there that we want to display back in the view. We also have this other MVC thing called a binding result, which is used to process results that occur from JAX-RS or bean validation bindings. Okay. So this is one of our login methods. This is a login method that doesn't use any special validation. And you can see what it does is it takes, it has a post, right? Has a path, so these are actually JAX-RS annotations. Then it has a CSRF valid annotation, which specifically opts into CSRF for this request. It takes a couple form parameters, okay? And then it gets a result back from the user service based on the username and password. And if everything turns out okay, it puts a user object in the session because, hey, this is a web app with session state. So we can actually put something in the session, which you can't do with JAX-RS. And then we return a redirect. So what this is going to do is basically say redirect to the page todo.xhtml. Okay. This is equivalent to this code inside of standard JAX-RS, where you return a response object, or you call response.temporary redirect and do all this stuff. Okay. So this is just shorthand for the same thing that works inside of MVC. And then, of course, in your method here in this scenario, if you have logged in, if you haven't logged in, what this does is it puts the user ID in here, but it also puts the login error message, okay? So that you can display error messages back to the user, okay? Now, in this example, what's happening is we're actually doing validation inside of Polymer. Whoops. So the reason you saw a validation error earlier was because Polymer has some client-side validation as well. So you can see here we have a pattern for the password, right? And also a pattern for the user as well. Okay, but if we wanted to enforce this on the server using MVC, we could do something like this. We could use this method down here, which actually uses bean validation. Okay. So by having this validate on execution set to none, so the bean validation doesn't get executed right away, okay, we basically can call this other method and pass in a login form object. That login form could then use bean validation to do the same sort of validation you saw in the client. And ideally, you'd probably want to do it in both places, right, the client and server, to do that same validation using the same regular expression. Okay, and so this is the entire login form bean. So by throwing it in here as the parameter, just by having those same fields, name and password, right, which are annotated here, username, user ID, and password, those would be sent in, and then that's where we can look at that binding result. So the binding result will tell us if things failed, okay, and then we can also get all the messages back. And then we can go through those, and then we can use this other, I injected this messages class here to keep track of all the error messages. Now this is actually not part of MVC yet, but we're pushing for it to be part of MVC so that there's an easy way to display error messages. So that's what you would see inside here. And those messages would then be displayed back to the user in the page using your sort of normal features. So that's what this is doing here. This is going back through those error messages and displaying those error messages back. Okay. So, and probably the best thing to do would be to do both, right? To do the validation on the client and then also do it on the server just to make sure. Okay. So that's sort of your quick idea about MVC, right? So you can see how you can do you can do routing, right, by returning an actual string back here from an actual method, right? You can use the JavaServer annotations, right? And the other example of this is the main controller, okay? So once you log into the application, you have this task controller to deal with all this stuff, right? And that's done with this task controller object. So task controller, you see the path is tasks, right? And it actually does mostly JavaServer, okay? So you can mix and match JavaServer with MVC. So here I'm supporting put, post, get, delete, etc. There's also a controller method here as well. So if I wanted to, I could do a controller, mix and match MVC methods inside the controller. So the JavaServer stuff looks kind of like this. If I go here and then I do resources, task list, lo and behold, I get JSON back, right? Because what's happening in this list mapping here is I'm producing JSON, right? And I'm returning a list of tasks back from the task service, and I call response.ok to return an OK response back, okay? So all that's happening in the application is it's talking to that service. Now on the actual page is this task.x page. And what's interesting about here is, what's interesting about this is a couple things. Number one, this is using facelets, not JSP, because again, MVC can work with either one out of the box, okay? We are again using those paper components. So we've got the drawer panel, we've got a scroll panel, etc. We've got a menu in there. And what's interesting is that main part that you see there that has all those tasks, that's actually another custom component, okay? So there's an MVC Tasks Component, which I wrote for this project, that actually defines a web component that you could use in different applications that handles the tasks. So it has some special styling. It uses this Polymer component called Iron Ajax to actually talk to the endpoints and then turn the results into an object that I can work with in JavaScript. And that object, that result, is then bound and used inside of this particular web component. So this has the buttons at the top. It has, it iterates through the components using this is DOM repeat template, okay? And then inside of there, it has different components to handle all the different icons. Okay. Then there's some JavaScript that goes through and then creates, handles the logic for this particular task component. Okay. So that should give you sort of a quick idea. And what's nice about this model is that we've encapsulated all the functionality and communication inside of this task component. That task component then talks to JAX-RS, right? And we're using MVC for sort of the overall routing inside of the application. But this particular part of the application is actually single page, right? It just does, just talks to JAX-RS, gets JSON back, etc., and does updates. Okay. All right, so I believe we're out of time. If you want to find this code, you can just go to GitHub and look for either Kito 99 or search for Polymer Java EE. If you go for Polymer MVC, lo and behold, there it is. Okay, so it should be easy to find. All the code for the slides and the code, the sample code is there as well. And the last thing I have to say is that it is about time for lunch, right? So I've been told to point out that if you're hungry and you want lunch, Northpoint.io is supporting lunch. So you should thank them, the proud lunch sponsor for the first day of jDays. So, all right, I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much for coming. And if you're interested in more of the server-side web framework stuff, I have an advanced Prime Faces session later today. Okay, thank you.